Thank you very much. Contemporary vernacular and classical architecture, keeping the styles alive. Now that was the commission title for my talk here today, so let us see what came out of it. First of all, I think we have to ask, what is a style? I would argue that it is a kind of language with words, grammar, and meaning. And in a sense, we could say that it is an aesthetic archetype. It's a particular language. So about the same way as a language has words, grammar, and meaning, architectural style has material, form, and symbolism, which is basically what Plato calls the true, the beautiful, and the good. Now, the eternal task of the architect has always been to take the material at hand, to combine it with some supposedly good intentions, which contains meaning through symbolism, and merge this into a beautiful form, with meaning, applying the grammar of the architecture. As for styles, we have a lot of those. Following the period of historicism, there was a flourishing of regional styles, basically a continuation of vernacular architecture and medieval impulses. We had the same thing in Norway. We had the famous dragon style, the Swiss style, etc. We had local railway stations, and internationally we had Art Nouveau, Jugendstil, Art Deco, and others. Now, can you imagine if we had continued building like this? What a beautiful place it would have been. And instead we got this, a revolution, an anti-style, if you will, with the aspiration of transcending styles. And as we learned from Adolf Loos, ornament became crime, and evolution of the culture that meant removal of ornaments from objects in practical use. Now, as we learned yesterday, Adolf Loos actually said something else 20 years later. My opinion has always been that at this time he was rather young. He was ambitious, he was an idealist. 20 years later he was perhaps a little more mature and had sort of come to his senses. But that was too late. The war was on. The styles had to fight for survival. They have survived, in a way. It's the prefabrication industry, actually, and the cultural heritage sector who have kept the styles alive. The former is highly underrated. It's in a way incomplete, but they are alive. So how can we keep them alive today? Well, it's basically two ways. We can either do new construction or we can reuse existing buildings. And we will have a look at a few examples of the latter to look at here. But before we do that, I just want to bring a few concepts to the table. What is reuse when we talk about that today? A concept we meet immediately is restoration, which basically means returning to a former or original condition. Now, this sometimes involves choosing a style because you do not always know the full history of the building. Or you could do a rehabilitation, which is more to restore and repair for present use. You restore what you can, what is reasonable, within reach, and the rest you modernize. Or you can go all out and do a renovation. When you repair and improve for present use, basically you replace things and modernize. So the two buildings on the right there on the photo, they were originally identical. The one to the right is restored, the one to the left is renovated, and you can see the difference in style. But what was reused 100 years ago? Say yesterday. Now, they didn't have these concepts, they didn't use them the same way. This was always highly debatable, but it was more like they merged into some kind of stylistic idealism, asking questions like, how well could the building have been made in the first place, within its style, its aesthetic archetype? I'll show you just one example of what I mean. This is our great cathedral in Norway, Nidaros Cathedral, the world's northernmost cathedral. It was a Romanesque church. It ended up as a Gothic cathedral through restoration. It was called a restoration. It took place for 100 years. It's a large national issue, very highly tempered debates in public press, etc. So what happened? This is the final plan to the left by the architect Nordhagen, who was chosen for the task. It's basically more or less like this, that it is reconstructed, except for the two towers on the west front and some other parts. He had second thoughts. Some years later, he published what was called the EPOS plan to the right. which was somewhat more like the original that was there 70 years earlier. This created huge public distress. Why on earth shall you put a stamp of serfdom on our great cathedral? So what was actually chosen was stylistic idealism. How good, how well could this building have been built in the first place? Okay, before we go into some practical examples, I just want to bring on a project equation that many of you are aware of. We may have a style that we want to employ, but we also have a client. He has preferences, and there's some thing called economy into it. There's regulation, may put restrictions on what you want to do, and there are some unknown factors, perhaps neighbors, audience, and we end up with a compromise. The architect is not God, he is not an independent artist who can put his works on display, he works within a framework. And the starting point may be something like this. The building has changed several times, and sometimes you do not know the original condition of it, as to the left down there. What is, you can see here, the upper window on the first floor has disappeared, the window type has changed, another window has disappeared, the entrance is totally rebuilt, the foundations are simplified, perhaps modernized, the stairs are modernized and they are different, etc. And the message here is that actually stylistic idealism may sometimes be a good choice. Sometimes you have to make it. I have a short example here. This is a small farmhouse. It looks like it does on the left, and we made a project like the one to the right. Now, this is clearly some kind of stylistic idealism. It may not be historically correct. Maybe that house is from the 1930s. We were actually not sure. Maybe it was from 1918 or something. We couldn't really see before we took off, started taking the building, sort of dissect it. What we did within this stylistic choice, we reintroduced original windows, then windows on the first floor, same type as you just saw on the other picture. We had to lift the roof here because you can see on the left, the roof is actually too low. It's almost down to the window. It's not really usable space in there. And the veranda came in place, and we changed the roof on this extension, which is not really very fortunate, but we didn't want to tear it down because the house is small. You can see from the other side, clearly stylistic idealization here going on. This was the interior, dark and narrow, so we had to do a complete interior renovation here, strengthening the construction, as you can see. And when we introduced these windows on the first floor, we discovered they had never been there. But still, we had done a stylistic choice. We completed that. And here you can see where we lifted the roof. By doing this and introducing those windows, we were able to let light into the first floor, open up the plan, and totally change this floor, I will have to say, to the better. A lot of work went into the details for the foundation here, for the woodwork. We produced a lot of details for this project. And this is for the front door, in place here around the door, you can see it. And we tested the design. We had drawn up the windows like this, but we see that, no, they are slightly too narrow. We have to widen them apart. And that's what we did down to the right there. You can see it there. And total exterior renovation as well. And it ended up like this. It's almost finished here on this photo. So you can see the building has totally changed, but at least this is a coherent style. But this was a farmhouse. You can see the farmhouses there. The owner bought this plot for about 80,000 euros. It was an investment project. You can see the barn to the right. There's a garage and in the middle, which is actually in the way. It's blocking the view down to our lake. And you can see the condition of these houses like this. So the first thing we did was to move the garage. We put it in line with the other two buildings. We made new foundations. We restored the barn. You can see we replaced the rotting sill. That's a restoration. But we renovated with the windows because there were not that many windows on this barn. If you look at the upper right, if it's possible to... There's an original window. We added more windows, same size actually, but you can see we renewed all the doors and windows here. As for the interior, this was not working as a barn anymore. We made it into a living space. And fixing the fence and garden, partly finished here. When we were about 60–70% finished, the owner was offered about 800,000 euros for the plot, 10 times the purchasing price. You could see, could argue that this is sort of stylistic compromise. It is. It's coherent, but it's slightly vulgar. But the owner of the site here, it was an investment project for him. He had strong opinions. He did a lot of the work himself. So the architect became a sort of consultant on the way. Okay. Case 2, a beautiful period house. Why should we mess around with this pearl? Isn't it okay? Well, as for the windows, they are clearly stylistically wrong. If you know the language, you can hear the error immediately. If you know the music, you can hear a false chord. And the simplified veranda later addition here, it's slightly awkward and slightly too small. There were a lot of renovation that had to be taken place indoors, new wet rooms, etc. The stairs are not original. They are slightly too narrow, not very practical. And we were able to find some photos, original photos. And you can see on the left there, the building was actually 1 story lower. And there are the original windows. The stairs are going straight down. You can see on the later photo, there was also a simplified entrance addition, common change on these old houses. And we ended up with a project like this. You can see the windows are in place here, the correct windows. We extended this veranda, make it more proportionate to the whole house, changing the roof angle. And on the other side, a similar volume to make it symmetrical. There we placed the new entrance and wet rooms. The stairs were taken down to its original shape and place, but technically improved, and a lot of other details. Okay, case 3, a large house. This was a former bakery, actually, which was in the basement there. This was actually a corner shop where you see the bush. You can see here windows from the 1980s, brickwork from the 1980s. We were able to find some original photos taken about 1920, but the building is slightly older. You can see the great windows in place there. They are totally changed on the version to the right. Post-war changes, the cladding, etc. What has continued is this bakery sign within the circle. And we made a project like this for rehabilitation, reinstalling correct windows, wider windows than the original on this broad facade, because they were actually slightly too narrow. We meant that this was more in style, this type of windows. It's actually a very large building. We needed also lighting here. Now, it was not so bakery anymore. This was an apartment, so we had to make a separate entrance here, and we reused the mansard type of roof here, which actually, this is actually not very common on this type of houses, but we reproduced that roof down here for the canopy, restored the corner shop, correct cladding stylistically, and a lot of other details. Case 4, quite unique parsonage. This is a house for a priest. It's in late classicism or empire style. It's named in Norway after Napoleon's empire. We had to repair the roof, replace all the tiles, constructional details, and there were lots of things to do with the cladding and details here. Actually, this is a master plan from our castle architect Lindstow. There are 5 buildings like this in existence in Norway. There are only 5 built, and they still exist. You can see here on the cladding, there's a moist problem here. That's because of soil added to the side of the house because of new sanitary installments. Very unfortunate solution. They filled up with about 50 centimeters soil outside and made this problem. And here you can see rotted details. Not all the technical solutions from 1840 were really adequate. We had to do some changes. Who's there? Something halted here. Okay, this is on the roof. We can see rot problems here too. And we had to do some rehabilitation, not restoration. We had to introduce some better materials adequate for the job and improve some of the technical solutions for this roof. As for visible details, we did a restoration, minute copying of details. While for the roof, we had to do a renovation, improve some things. For example, this is a huge roof. It has to take a lot of load. We had to straighten up, as you can see, the whole roof and make it watertight. Hoisting up all the tiles. This is really, I don't recall how many tons, but this is really heavy. You can see the roof is large, and also you can see the coloring here. It's not a unison, it's not one color. Sorry, there's something happening here, some people clicking into that you can't see. But the type of tile that is used is, sorry, there's someone doing something with this computer or remotes, I'm sorry. Portalberg 451 Victorian. This is commonly used for this type of renovation projects all over Northern Europe. And what we did here was to keep the original style, but we did technical improvements, basically. So the last case, saving a Jugendhaus. Now, the new owner of this house, he wanted or needed a new entrance with some wet room facilities, modernizing. He made drawings, as you can see here, from the plan and the facade, which was declined by the local building authorities, luckily. As you can see, what he basically wanted to do was to add a box to the house. Main problem is the roof, but also you can see this is really not in style. You have to do something else. When we arrived at the scene, it looked like this. He had already completed the foundation and plumbing without permission. He started. So it was rather limited what we were able to do. We had to operate on this concrete platform. And we ended up with the project like this. Basically, what we did was to continue the original roof style. The angle is actually not perfect if you measure it, but we have to make it look perfect, and therefore we adjusted the angle. And adding canopy roof in style and some other details. Okay, this is very brief. What can you learn from this? Keeping the styles alive. I would argue that doing this is, in many cases, a natural choice. It maintains culture and beauty, but it does require some compromises. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.